Hi everyone. Let's see if we can understand a little bit about a World Championship game. So this is game one. It occurred today. The white pieces were played by Jan Nepomniachtchi and Magnus Carlsen had the black pieces. So Nepo opened with e4 as he usually does. And in the last World Championship match where Carlsen played Caruana, Carlsen was playing the Sicilian defense, unbalancing the position from move one. But here he plays the more solid e5. And the players go into a Ruy Lopez. And at this point, sometimes Carlsen does play the ultra-solid Berlin defense with knight f6, but this time he goes for the main line, Morphy's defense, a6. The bishop retreated, knight f6 now, castling, and bishop to e7. And this is all the main line. This begins what's known as the closed variations of the Ruy Lopez. And white defense is e-pawn. And now white is threatening to take the knight on c6, removing the defender of the e5 pawn and then capturing on e5. And black will not have any counterplay since white has just defended his pawn. So it's time for black to play b5 and kick the bishop back so it cannot take on c6. Now the main line continues with black making the following two moves in some order. Black wants to play d6 and castles in the main line. He can do those two moves in either order, but if you castle first, as Carlsen did, then you reserve the possibility of pushing your d-pawn all the way to d5 and entering what's known as a marshal's attack. For example, if white continues with the main move here, c3, giving his bishop a little room and trying to gain a strong center here, supporting the move d4, then black could respond with d5, which is known as marshal's attack. And I guess not a lot of players want to face that as white, especially if they're trying to win the game. So there are a lot of anti-marshal lines. For example, a4 is an anti-marshal line, and so is h3, which is what Nepo decided to play in this position. And I think the point is, if black wants to play a marshal here by playing d5, which is not what happened in the game, then it doesn't work out so great for black because white hasn't committed his pawn to c3 yet. And that allows white in some positions to put his knight on c3 to counteract the marshal attack. Okay, so h3 is like an anti-marshal. And now Carlsen plays an ultra rare move in this position. I was looking at the database on Lichess, the Masters database, and there were over 4,000 games in this position, and only 8 times was this move played, knight to a5. I didn't even realize that was a move in this position or similar positions. I was always told that you want to go after the bishop pair here, and knight to a5 is a good way to do that. But first you have to prepare that by protecting your e-pawn. And then what normally occurs is something like c3, so that if black does go after the bishop pair, white can still save it. But Carlsen doesn't bother to protect his e-pawn. He just plays knight to a5 right away. So I had no idea this was a possibility. And it's not a novelty. As I said, it was played at least 8 times. But apparently in the press conference, I think that Nepo hinted or said outright that he was prepared for that move, knight to a5. Okay, and he takes up the challenge and he takes the e5 pawn, and black takes the bishop pair. And white captures back towards the center, giving his rook a half-open file here. And then what you're looking at here is black is down a pawn, but he has the bishop pair, and he wants to open the game quickly so that his bishops are better than white's minor pieces. Also, white does have those doubled b pawns. So black is going to try to strive for a lot of activity with his pieces to get compensation for the pawn deficit. And Carlsen starts with bishop to b7, attacking the central pawn on d4 right away. We've got 2 attackers here, only 1 defender. So Nepo defends it with d3, and now there's a very important move. The engine tells me the only move for black here that doesn't hand white a strong advantage is d5. Continuing to hammer at the e4 pawn, and it's important to do it now. For example, suppose black makes some other move like d6. Well, then the knight on e5 is going to move out of the way, and now it's too late to open up the center with d5 because now the e pawn can pass it by. So black does not want that to happen. Another possibility is c5 is a move that the engine suggested as a third choice. And white can again move his knight out of the way so that if black does push this pawn, then the e pawn can go forward. So while that knight is still on the e5 square, it's time to play d5. So the e4 pawn is not going anywhere. And then white has to exchange it. Black brings the queen to the center of the board with a mate in one threat on the g2 square. And white decides to stop that with queen to f3, challenging the queen. White would love to trade pieces being a pawn up. And now Carlsen makes a very clever move here. He plays bishop to d6. He doesn't initiate the trade himself. He allows Nepo to trade the pieces instead. And bishop to d6 is a threat here. There's a very subtle threat. There are two attackers on that knight with only one defender. But there are a lot of tactics in the air. For example, let me just make a non-move here. Looks like maybe black can take like this and win a piece. But instead of recapturing, white has this intermediate move first, and then he recaptures so black doesn't end up winning a piece. That's not really black's threat. It's not bishop takes e5 that is the threat. It's actually queen takes e5, revealing an attack on the queen and an attack on the rook at the same time. That's the main threat in the position. For example, white can blunder here with the seemingly natural knight to c3. Developing a piece, looks like you're gaining a tempo on the queen there, and you're not afraid of this, like we said, because of this intermediate move. But that's exactly when black would unleash this tactic. Queen takes e5, and now white is completely busted. If he takes the queen, black takes the queen. Then if white saves his rook, black saves his bishop, and black is up a piece and has a winning position. Okay, so because of that, Nepo needs a very accurate move here, and he plays the very good move king to f1. And not only are you improving your king, getting it closer to the center and defending the e-file against possible incursions later on in the game, but you're defending the rook so that this tactic doesn't work anymore. And so Carlsen abandons that idea, and he decides to play the, at first, very strange looking rook Fb8, crowding his rooks over there on the queen side like that. But the point of that is to defend the bishop, renewing the threat of queen takes knight again. Okay, so that's an excellent move to defend that bishop. And this queen could even go somewhere else and reveal an attack on the queen, and black doesn't have to worry about dropping the bishop. And I think the purpose of using this rook rather than the other one is this rook is doing a pretty good job defending this pawn, which may be pushed later on. So I think that's the rook that belongs there, even though it looks a little strange to crowd the rooks over on that side of the board. And so it's at this time, finally, white decides to trade queens, simplifying the position. And then the knight comes to the center. Perhaps the knight wants to get to the b4 square, so white prevents that with bishop d2. Black expands with his pawns. The knight just drops back to safety here, opening the e-file. The rook was no longer doing anything on b8, so it moves to a central file. Knight to c3 looked a little strange, blocking the action of the bishop, allowing the knight to come to b4, which it does. And now white has to do something about the c2 pawn. We can't allow these rooks to be forked and that pawn to drop. So white plays the passive-looking rook ec1. He had to decide which rook to defend with, and I suppose he decided this rook wasn't doing much on this file. All these squares are covered, even though it's on an open file. And so he preferred this rook to remain on the the A file, still pressuring that A6 pawn. So he defends passively with his E rook, and then black moves his other rook to the C file. Knight to E2. Now there is an attack on the knight. I'm not sure if black wants to trade that or not in that particular manner. He decides not to. He drops his knight back, trying to reroute it to a better square. Probably saying, okay, white, your pieces are not very active right now. You don't have a lot of space. Black still has these bishops raking across the position, and these pawns are gaining black a lot of space here. So he has time to reroute his knight to other squares. Bishop E3 was played, knight E7, probably coming to D5 to pressure the bishop on E3. Bishop F4. So white takes the time to exchange a pair of bishops here to stop black from having that bishop pair advantage. But black has a way to gain equality here by ruining white's pawn structure. He takes on F3 and then trades the bishops. So white still remains a pawn up, but he has a lot of weak pawns. All of these pawns here are very weak. He still has these doubled pawns over here. And we're getting closer to a rook and pawn endgame that looks very drawish. So white no longer really has an advantage. The engine tells me it's just dead equal here. Okay, the pawn on A6 is now hanging after those exchanges, so the black rook on C8 comes up to defend it. Okay, rook E1 going back to the open file, hitting the knight. The knight goes to F5. And that knight has a couple of good squares he may want to land on over here on D4 or H4. White really doesn't want the knight to go to D4 where it's going to fork that pawn and that pawn. So he protects that square with C3. But unfortunately, that does weaken the B3 and D3 squares. So black can pressure those points at some point during the game. So black heads towards H4 since he couldn't go to D4. So now he's hitting this F3 pawn. I wondered what happens if black tries to win this pawn on D3 by playing G5 to remove the defender of that pawn. Well, it doesn't really work out so well. It's a fine move, but it's just equal according to the engine. The line given is knight G2, and then if black takes the pawn, white immediately gets counterplayed with rook to E5. Hitting that undefended knight, and if the knight moves, the G-pawn behind it falls. Black doesn't want to defend by taking on F3 because the king comes to E2 and that rook is trapped. So instead, black can try defending the knight like this, keeping the G-pawn, but then the other pawn on C5 will fall. White can actually push the rook back first and then take on C5. Maybe black gets in a check here, drives the king back, but the position is about equal. Even a little bit in white's favor according to the engine. So black didn't go for that line with G5. Instead he plays knight H4, and white has to defend on F3, and the best way to do that is with the rook. So the rook actually supports both of these weak pawns here. And now Carlsen makes a very human move. He plays king F8, getting the king closer to the center, protecting the E file from potential incursions later on. But another line I heard some commentators mentioning was the move G6. And I think the purpose of that will be made clear if we take a look at what happened in the game. So here, white decides after king F8 to play knight G2 to kick that knight out of there so the rook doesn't have to continually defend that pawn. The knight would have to fall back to F5, which hits the rook and makes the rook move and looks like the D pawn is falling. But the rook can come to E5 with tempo, so black doesn't have time to take the D3 pawn. Now black can defend the knight with G6, and now white has time to defend the D3 pawn with something like knight E1. So that's how the game went, but notice what would have happened if instead of king F8, G6 was played immediately. if white now tries to drive out the black knight in the same manner with knight g2, then when it goes to f5, that knight is already defended. So white's going to drop this d pawn. That rook is not going to gain a tempo now by moving to e5. And then black simply takes on d3. So now here, black is just a little bit better according to the engine. So g6 was maybe a try to get somewhat of an advantage in the position. But king f8 was played, and then knight g2 kicks the knight out. The rook gains that tempo back. Black defends. Knight e1 defends d3. And now the knight reroutes itself to g7 here, coming to e6 later on. Rook to e4, perhaps protecting some of these squares against pawn advances. f5 is played, driving the rook back. Knight e6. Knight ge2, protecting that square. The knight might hop into that square. b4. Now black has a strong plan here. He wants to exchange pawns, leaving the b3 pawn exposed, and then he wants to attack it down the b file and win a pawn. So white has to play very accurately here. Before we take a look at what happened, again, I was interested in this move f4, trying to remove the defender of the d3 pawn. Well, in this case, the rook can come to e4, and now there's a counterattack on the f4 pawn by 2 pieces. So white's not going to lose any material. If black tries to take on d3, not only can white win the pawn back on f4, but he even has this tactic. He can take the knight off the board and then fork the rooks. Okay, something like this. And then, again, the position is about equal. Okay, so f4 doesn't accomplish much, so b4 was played. And now white needs a plan, and he needs a good one, because it looks like black is in control now, getting pressure down the b file. And Nepo comes up with a great plan. He walks his king over to the queen side. So his idea is to get his king over to c2 and just protect all these pawns and protect any incursion down the b file. Okay, and then rook b8 was played, so the threat now is to take here, recapture, and then take on b3. The king comes over as intended, and now black does take on c3. Now it looks like white is just in time to come over here and protect his pawns, but that wasn't white's plan. If he plays king takes c3 now, black is just winning in the position after knight to d4. Now there's pressure here and more importantly here, and white cannot protect things. He can't even play rook to a3 here because there would be a knight fork winning the exchange. The best white could do actually is to protect the b2 pawn by rook to a2, and then give up that pawn on b3, fall back to d2, and black can double up and attack b2 further. King c1 protects it, and white is completely passive. His pieces can't move, and black is dominating. The engine says black is winning. So going back, you can't take with the king, so white's plan all along was to recapture with the pawn and give up the b3 pawn. So finally, white gives his 1 pawn advantage back. But look what happened. He straightened out his pawns. He now has pretty healthy pawn structure here. And his king is just in time to go to c2 and protect that b file. It looks like black is ready perhaps to double up on that file and threaten to come into b2, but he can't do that because that rook is overloaded. It's protecting both of those pieces. White would simply win the knight. And if the rook took on e6, then black loses the other rook on b3, and white is up a piece. So you can't double the rooks, so the black rook on b3 has to retreat. It goes to b7, and now h4 was played, keeping the knight off of that square. Now, Magnus comes up and protects the knight with king f7, maybe trying to double rooks again and not have to worry about any tactics. But people were commenting that a possibility here that you have to continually watch out for is this tactic, knight to d4 check. The point is that white cannot take the knight because then when the pawn recaptures with check, the rook is falling and black will have a winning material advantage. However, after rook to d4 check, white can simply drop the king back somewhere like to d1 here, and now the knight really is threatened on d4 and it just has to retreat. And so black didn't accomplish anything there with knight to d4. I was watching Ben Feingold, who suggested that to make this threat of knight to d4 carry a little more weight, black could have tried a5, maybe with the idea of getting a rook behind the a pawn and trying to push that pawn forward. The idea here is that the pawn is invulnerable. You can't take the pawn because now this threat is worth something, because if the king falls back to the first rank, then rook to b1 check comes and this rook is no longer defending that rank. And white is in trouble here. He's losing, in fact. Only legal move is to go up to d2. But then the other rook comes in with a mate threat on b2. Notice you don't want to go for this fork here because you simply have king to c2 in response. Okay, but that move rook to b6, rook c to b6 is fatal. So a5 was a possible way to press for a little bit of an advantage, but instead king to f7 was played, and then white connects his rooks, probably trying to defend the b file in case black doubles up on the b file. King f6, getting the king closer to the center. The knight comes in towards the center. Rook d7, knight c4. Great square for the knight. It can't be driven away there. And it was threatening a fork on e6, forking the rooks, so Magnus gets a rook out of the way. But white plays knight e5 anyway and says, this rook, what are you going to do? You're going to have to defend that pawn, but you can't go anywhere but here or here, and either place you go, I'm going to attack you again. And the game actually ended in a draw by repetition at this point. And I think that's a correct result. The engine tells me it's all zeros. Nobody is really winning. Nepo certainly may have been afraid. Feingold was saying he may have been afraid of facing a passed pawn on each side of the board. For example, at some point, black may push the h pawn to h5 and then trade the g pawn for the h4 pawn and gain that passed h pawn, and he'd have these two passed pawns on either end to deal with. So white really had nothing to play for, and I suppose black didn't either. So I think this was a very well played game with no mistakes by either player, and I would say it's a big success for Carlsen to start out with a draw with the black pieces, especially with that almost novelty in the opening, knight to a5, which looks good to me. If I get that position, I would like to try that myself. I love having the bishop pair in an open position, so it's something for me to remember. All right, I hope you learned something from this video. I sure did. Thanks for watching.